At first, there was a whisper, then a roar, and then the iron howl of rebar tearing the sky, as a continent weary of its own illusions suddenly opened its eyes to a new era of thunder and ash. Europe entered the night like a ship into a starless storm. No compass, no shores, driven only by an instinct for survival that faded beneath the boots of war. Roads that only yesterday echoed with the sleepy creak of wagons now trembled under endless columns, rolling east and west, absorbing the weight of tanks, the scrape of armor, the hot breath of engines smelling of kerosene, fear, and coming retribution. Cities turned into stone organs playing the apocalyptic trumpet, every street a new note of alarm, every block a pause before the next strike of fate. To the south, smoke rose over the ports like black sunflowers of war, drawn toward an invisible wind carrying a single word: inevitability. To the north, where fields lay flat like the blank pages of an unwritten book, the plow gave way to treads. The earth became a map written in fire. Behind the windows of small houses, where yesterday people baked bread and hung laundry, there came a low, growing hum that shattered glass into microscopic tears. War did not enter through the front door, but through the ceiling, the cellar, the breath of everyone still hoping to hide beneath a table or inside a prayer. But prayers snapped like thin threads and turned to ash. And somewhere far across the ocean, at the other edge of the world, others were gathering. Men who did not yet know they would become the hands that would carve open the granite of war. They were not the faces of glory or the stars of parades. Their tools did not gleam in sunlight. Their voices did not echo in the news. Yet their breathing would fill the heart of battle, each breath measuring the distance between life and explosion. This profession lived in silence, but worked in thunder. These men could hear through the ground, the whisper of metal, the pulse of the road under a boot, the false lullaby of a bomb promising only eternity to those who dared disturb its sleep. Under the spotlights, war paints an image of perfection: straight ranks, parade speeches, an orchestra, silver light gleaming on polished shoes. But spotlights lie. The real stage of war is mud, thick, uncertain ground, where every step might be the last. Lamps, there are not beacons, but burning grass. The sky is not a backdrop, but a collapsing ceiling. And down there, in the cracks of time, appear those who will later be called engineers. Sappers then, nameless, faceless, titleless. Their tools were measuring tapes, probes, metal shears, tiny weights, and nerves stretched thinner than wire. Their perfection was the ability to live between the heartbeats of a mine. Fear, for the enemy, does not grow from myth, it grows from experience. The Wehrmacht learned to fear not loud names or noble slogans, but the men who came at night and vanished before dawn, leaving silence where there had been a wall and a road where there had been only death. They did not shout. They calculated. Centimeters, seconds, grams, kilograms, angles, alloys. What to others was chaos, to them was formula, and their footsteps weighed more than gunfire. Europe then was a roofless theater with its doors torn off and its curtain burned. Every port crane a skeleton raising its hand to the sky, every train station a chorus of destinies, every whistle a gunshot. Villages sat still as old men watched the roads like rivers that could never be crossed. You did not enter such geography carelessly. You studied it like a musical score, where any note could be a trap. A road could be mined, a bridge could be wired, a phone line could lead straight to hell. Here, every if ended with when. And so came those who made the impossible possible. War destroys. The sapper creates by destroying. For him, An explosion is a tool, a scalpel. It opens passages, clears the arteries of roads, cuts tumors from concrete. The surgeon fears the tremor of his hand. The sapper fears the tremor of the earth, because the earth always answers, sometimes too loudly. And when that answer comes, a column of smoke rises like an invisible monument to someone's mistake, and the silence that follows feels not like relief, but judgment. In the West, commanders began to speak of the impossibility of attack without clearing the way first, not just of barbed wire or debris, but the very logic of enemy defense. Engineering ceased to be a supplement to infantry. It became its nervous system. A fortress was a nerve cluster, a bridge, a synapse, a sapper, the one who cuts the right nerve at the right second. The myth of war always paints a hero with a weapon, but real history remembers heroes with wire coiled on their arm and clippers in their pocket. Their trophies were blueprints. Their battles were 12-hour shifts under rain, fingers numb, searching by touch for the right wire. Their duels were fought on a palm's distance. Their enemy was not only man, but metal, chemistry, and time. And their greatest terror was silence, for silence never warned. As waves of war swept the continent, on faraway islands, in ports and camps, a new craft matured. One that to outsiders seemed tedious, yet to insiders was deadly precise. The engineer's alphabet was simple: find, identify, diffuse, demolish, build, advance. But every letter hid a universe of choices. What type of mine? Where's the trap? What trigger? Magnetic or pressure? How much charge? Where to set it to destroy, but not die? The answers came from Earth itself, from shattered bridges and bricks that still whispered when tapped, and from the faces of those who would follow, because behind every calculation stood not theory, but footsteps that must keep moving forward. But the enemy learned quickly. Where there was one trap yesterday, tomorrow there would be 3. Where there was one mine, tomorrow there would be a cunning cascade demanding thought sharper than steel. Every mistake was paid for instantly, in full. Yet it was here that fear took root, not from mystery, but pattern. For after these men passed, no line of defense remained intact. Europe shrank like a fist stripped of fingers, each front stretched beyond endurance. In villages, tunnels, bridges, people waited, listening, praying. Under torn skies, where stars flared and drowned in smoke, a column appeared, still distant, but inevitable. They would come. They always came, marking their path with white flags, chalked arrows, and small tin notes scribbled by pencils that always broke at the most important word. Their presence was quiet as a verdict, eloquent as deliverance. Every war has its spotlighted scene, its applause and ceremony. But this story's light is dim. A single bulb above a table covered with maps, rulers, fragments of pencils, rain-soaked notebooks. Here, under this faint glow, decisions are made that will decide lives tomorrow. The man bent over these charts doesn't think of glory. He thinks of order, sequence, precision. He knows perfection is not parade polish, but a series of invisible tasks done flawlessly. And so our chronicle begins, without grand words, but with the feeling that the earth itself takes a breath before diving deep. Europe in flames is not a metaphor. It is a technical state of matter where every road, farm, and frontier town is part of an electric circuit that must be broken so life can flow again. And far away, footsteps draw nearer, men who will learn to read that circuit by heart. Their journey is just beginning. When the spotlights fade, those who remain will be the ones for whom darkness is not an enemy, but a condition of work. They will be the silent hammer whose strike can crack even the hardest wall. When war turned from a storm on the horizon into an endless downpour, the U.S. Army realized, to move through this waterfall, you had to learn to cut water with a knife, to turn a raging flow into controlled streams. That was how a new school of military engineering was born, not as an appendix to infantry, but as the true brain of every operation. It learned to think in wires, angles, and seconds, like a surgeon guided by vessels and pulse. In training camps, where the earth was plowed not by tractors but by shovels, new companies emerged. Men who learned to speak to metal, to measure time by the tremor of the ground, and to tell the type of detonator by the scent of wet wood. Their future craft demanded a taste for silence and respect for chance, a force to be tamed with discipline, as if sewing a dense fabric through layers of chaos. Random people had no place here. Selection was hidden and strict, an initiation into a brotherhood whose rules were scribbled in the margins of maps and manuals. Their hands were clean, but always smelled of oil. Their eyes were calm, because panic makes mistakes louder than explosions, and their memory was sharp, clinging like a cat's claws on a ledge. They saw space differently. A road wasn't a line, it was a system. A bridge wasn't an arch, it was a web of interlocking forces. A building wasn't walls, it was a network of tensions, where one brick could close the circuit and another could break it. They learned to find weakness in thickness, to hear secrets buried in wet soil, to notice how dry wood betrays the presence of metal beneath it. Their first commandment was like a prayer: never trust the obvious, for obviousness is a trap's favorite mask. A plank on the road isn't for keeping boots clean, it might hide a pressure plate. A ripple in fresh gravel isn't a flaw, it's the breath of a buried charge. A shadow isn't random, it hides a wire that leads to death's machinery. In this world, vision had to be diffused, not direct, like a lantern beam in fog, parting it gently so shapes revealed themselves on their own. Training became ritual. Every motion had its place and purpose. Knife under one finger, probe under another, cutters melting into the hand. Even breathing matched the rhythm of movement, so not a tremor escaped in the split second when a misstep meant death. They learned to crawl like shadows and walk like wind, leaving no trace where the earth remembered too well. They wrote short instructions for men who might be sleepless for 3 days and still had to understand every word. They built explosions that destroyed exactly what was needed, not an inch more, because every extra crack could cost a life tomorrow. Discipline was both guardian and God. It forgave nothing. There was no room for flair, only for tireless repetition until flesh and tool became one, and chance had no space between them. In that monotony lived what others would later call courage, the ability not to err when every mistake ends the same. The sapper was a kind of watchmaker, but one tending to mechanisms built for destruction, not beauty. It was this slow, almost prayerful precision that bred fear in the enemy, because it killed chaos as a refuge. The enemy had counted on panic, weather, exhaustion, on randomness turning battle into roulette. But these men arrived and shut down chaos like a light switch. Then the line of defense stopped being a line and turned into a faint mark, ready to be erased. The roots of this school grew not only from textbooks, but from civilian trades brought to war: carpenters, fitters, surveyors, electricians, people who could read blueprints, listen to materials, and understand how pressure bends or breaks matter. From these trades arose a new kind of soldier, whose uniform concealed not only muscles, but logic. In barracks battered by rain, a new faith was forming. In correctness of procedure, in the holiness of sequence, in checking even what's already checked, because fatigue always hides in familiar places. Training grounds looked like theater stages, model bridges, obstacle fields, mock villages with hidden traps, roads with secret seconds. Every day was a new play, with a script known only to the earth, and actors who had to guess the ending before the curtain fell. They learned to love slow counting. 1, inhale. 2, exhale. 3, pause. 4, probe. 5, glance. 6, listen. Until hearing could tell emptiness from metal, and the skin could feel where soil was too light, like a sleeping child, or too heavy, like a man with secrets. The first baptism of fire always came suddenly, as if someone had torn a page from the manual and replaced it with reality. A small village bridge, simple at first glance, turned out to be a knot of hidden threats. Beneath the planks, void. In the void, a wire. Beyond the wire, a spring, and behind it, a patient trap, waiting for one careless step. Then, the training came alive. Hands found the right knife, breath found its rhythm, eyes spotted the millimeter that separated life from thunder. Someone performed their first quiet miracle, breaking the circuit. After that, they began to treat silence as a senior partner, and that respect became their armor. Commanders demanded not only obedience, but imagination, because the enemy had imagination too. The task didn't end with diffusing, it began there. How to lead a column faster than the traps can reset. How to deceive enemy eyes, making them expect explosions where there would be silence, and let infantry pass where they expected death. The sapper became the architect of advance, the draftsman of tempo, the conductor of the army's heartbeat. And so another legend was born, of men who cared nothing for glory, yet built the stage for others to earn it. At night, when rain drummed on helmets like the fingers of fate and the road disappeared into black distance, they went first, so that by morning others could march loud and confident. If the enemy heard thunder at dawn, it was only because silence had worked through the night above it. From craft, from discipline, from reverence for silence, a new power arose, one the enemy had no name for, but could feel in every nerve of his defense. These men didn't promise miracles, but they made them when the road demanded it, and the louder the world screamed of war, the deeper they believed in quiet order, because only order can shatter even the loudest walls. Their path now led to a grand stage without rehearsals, only premieres, and soon that stage would roar so loud the sea itself would tremble, and the earth would remember how firm hands broke open its wires once more. It looked more like a watchmaker's modest case, one that smelled of gunpowder, machine oil, and rain trapped in an old rag forgotten since the last assignment. Inside lay a craftsman's alchemy, probes thin as nerves, knives whose blades preferred oiled cloth to light, cutters sharp as verdicts, screwdrivers patient as monks, and flexible mirrors reaching into places where darkness kept its secrets. There were coils of wire, light as grass, yet able to carry human will through the night, and tiny weights that whispered to the ground, "Tell the truth." And the earth always answered, if touched the right way. Their weapons didn't impress the eye. They weren't made for show, but for solving the invisible, where language was sharper than steel and silence louder than any gunfire. In their hands, danger became material, like clay in a sculptor's grip. They took fear and pressed it into form, measured, calculated, and finally turned off, like a lamp. The enemy set traps and trusted in chance. The engineers turned chance into geometry, where death had only two moves, both predicted. From this was born the legend, a man who arrived with a bag of tools and left with an open road where yesterday steel had screamed. Every object had its task and its story. The probe, a simple antenna to the heart of the earth, taught fingers to hear the shift of soil beneath a blade of grass or beneath a puddle's edge. It pushed back with a faint resistance, as if a buried metal tongue stirred under the skin of the ground. The mirror, angled just so, caught a pale line of light and showed an eye where no head could fit. Beneath a beam, beneath a step, within the ribs of some hidden machine where a spring might sleep. The pliers came alive when they met a wire, and in that instant, no tremor was allowed. Metal sensed doubt, the way an animal senses fear. In one pocket of that toolkit slept the explosive, not as a lump of brute power, but as a surgeon's instrument, precisely measured, carefully controlled, obedient to purpose. Every charge had to end like a period in a sentence, clean, exact, leaving meaning intact. The rule was simple: destroy only what must fall. The bridge should collapse where it blocks the enemy's way, but remain standing where your own will pass tomorrow. A wall must open a path, not crumble into a torrent of brick that erases the plan. So weight wasn't guessed, it was negotiated. They listened to cracks, felt the ribs, counted seams, wind, humidity, temperature. Each detail became part of the score, like notes in a symphony. It was this respect for the quiet facts, not for loud steel, that created the enemy's unease. Where he trusted force, a man appeared with a ruler. Where he expected shouting, there came a whisper of measurements, and vast fortresses obeyed small, exact gestures, surrendering not because they were broken, but because they had been reasoned with. That politeness of destruction frightened more than a battering ram. Some tools looked almost playful: chalk for tiny marks on asphalt, thin flags on wire stems that swayed like toys, soggy notebooks where numbers blurred into misty constellations. Yet these toys kept order through the night: where to step, where not to, what was safe, what still alive. One white streak of chalk could mean more than a commander's cry. One short arrow could save an hour for a column that might otherwise step where iron feeds on flesh. But the most important tool wasn't in the bag. It beat in the chest and rested behind the eyes. Patience. Patience wasn't idleness. It was a weapon. The strength to hold the hand that already knows the answer and check again. Because the truth often hides behind certainty. Patience was an inner metronome, marking invisible beats between breath and movement, between glance and cut, between maybe and exact. It turned every minute into an echoing hall where a single wrong note returned as thunder. Those who mastered that pause became shields stronger than armor. There are countless stories that begin the same way. Once, silence saved a battalion. 2 wires beneath the fingers, both black, both wet. The manual says, cut the left. Experience whispers, check again. The knife pauses midair like a verdict. A droplet on the glove catches a spark of light, almost unseen. And in that moment, the eye sees it. The trick hides to the right. The choice changes, and by morning, the battalion crosses a bridge that shouldn't exist. When the enemy later inspects his trap, he finds no blast, only a neatly extinguished circuit. Terrifying isn't the absence of explosion. It's the presence of someone who understood better than you. Beyond the small tools came the big hands, machines that took on the heaviest work, rollers pressing the ground until it confessed, mine-sweeping rigs clawing paths through fields. They weren't monsters of might, but extensions of caution, taking the first blow so man could remain prophet, not victim. Yet even beside those giants, the mind still ruled. Machines saw only straight lines. Danger preferred curves. They also carried words, codes, signals, short phrases trusted more than long orders. Clear to the first marker. Doubt on the right edge. Possible cascade. These were notes of a hidden symphony played through the night. To understand them instantly meant stealing time from death, which thrived on hesitation. Their language was a tool, a probe into darkness that always returned with clarity. The enemy's fear grew from one simple truth. Where these men passed, the magic of a minefield vanished. The mine contained not only metal, but a promise. No one will pass here. And suddenly, that promise failed. The psychology of defense collapsed along with the steel. First came a crack in faith, then another. If they cleared one trap, they will clear the next. If they found a way here, they will find a way there. The fortress fell not from the blast, but from the awareness that its spell was broken. And that collapse made more noise than any explosion. Among all their instruments, one seemed harmless: the watch. Yet time itself was their strict deity. The watch told how long to hold a breath, how long to test a knot, how long to wait for soil to settle after the first touch. It taught that haste is superstition's sister, and superstition, death's younger brother. If the enemy hoped for panic or rush, he was always disappointed. The engineer's pace came not from fear, but from task, a steady rhythm that became the iron music behind marching columns. And then there was their final, unseen instrument: memory. Memory of how wet earth folds over a shovel in night rain, how wire hums when tightened by an unsteady hand, how a wooden box smells not of wood, but of the explosive inside. Memory was their inner library, of scents, sounds, millimeters, labeled not by letters, but by touch. They opened those shelves in darkness, when eyes were blind and tools fell silent. And then, the right hand always found the right answer. Their greatest victories were almost always quieter than rain. A path opened before dawn, a bridge that didn't fall, a road that greeted tanks like familiar guests. And somewhere behind the lines, the enemy stared at his map, a map he swore was impenetrable, and saw that someone had crossed it. Fear began not with noise, but with realization. If someone can switch off monstrous machines, then monsters are not immortal. And every fortress suddenly felt like a house with a key already found. Thus their tools, humble, plain, almost childish, formed a system where every detail carried the weight of tomorrow's step. And when night lifted and dawn coated the grass in pale silver frost, the open road seemed like a miracle. But for those who worked in darkness, it was simply proof that silence, armed with precision, is stronger than thunder. Now that silence awaited its greatest test, where earth itself becomes the detonator and metal begins to breathe. That is where the legend of fearlessness would carve its name into the map, a line the storm could never erase. Their baptism by fire began in a place that smelled of the dust of fallen empires and the salt of ancient roads. The vast stretches of North Africa, where the wind polishes stone to blindness, and every trail can become a wire snare drawn tight by an invisible hand. The desert despises haste. Everything here is slow, persistent, built for endurance, and that made it the perfect teacher for men who came not to thunder forward, but to carve paths with a needle fine as a nerve. The columns moved like caravans, and within that ancient rhythm, a new craft had to find its place, clearing paths through minefields the enemy scattered like stars, beautiful from afar, deadly up close. There, in that blinding silence, it became clear. Their work wasn't a supplement to war. It was its pulse, setting the rhythm for the army's blood. Fear first appeared on the enemy's side in a strange form, the sight of movement where no one could pass. Slowly, without shouting or panic, a corridor opened. The desert, long trained to keep its secrets, began revealing them to men with probes and chalk. Lines of defense that once looked like petrified thunderclouds dissolved into vapor, easy to bypass, to split, to drain. That was when the enemy first heard a new kind of silence, one that didn't rest but worked through the night, transforming itself by dawn into a road. North Africa gave the craft its iron taste of sand and its respect for the horizon. where daylight shows everything, night hides everything, and dawn changes it all again. They learned to listen to wheels and tracks like musicians listening for wrong notes. Every sound could spell danger. They learned to read the trembling surface, fresh skin of sand laid not by wind, but by hand, a rock placed not as it fell, but as it was meant. And when they broke the deadly monotony, mine after mine, section after section, they weren't fighting the desert. They were negotiating with it, earning respect from the ground itself. The first breakthroughs weren't fireworks, but drafts of future legend, dry, exact, and quietly victorious. Every legend needs its sacred stage. Theirs was the bridge under fire. Whether built of timber, stone, or makeshift pontoons didn't matter. What mattered was that allies were waiting beyond. At night, when darkness wore the face of the enemy and flashes looked like eyes, they reached the river, where water hissed as it swallowed shrapnel and began assembling a path from parts that could each have been their last. Time compressed into breath. Inhale, hand the beam. Exhale, secure. Inhale, test the joint. Exhale, send the first truck across. When steel raced across the newborn bridge, it was like a child's first cry, not of pain, but of strength. Italy met them with stone, cunning, damp, layered, where every house was a fortress, every alley a trap, every staircase a vice. The enemy played with space as a joiner plays with wedges, a push here, a brace there, and everything locked tight. Urban war required the jeweler's precision and the monk's patience. There, the engineers learned to speak with architecture as with a living being, listening to beams like doctors to a heartbeat, tracing seams like explorers on a mountain face, diagnosing the wounds of a house before touching it with metal. And when a wall had to be opened, not into a room, but into the direction of attack, they didn't smash it, they unfolded it, gently, precisely, to let their troops in alive. In those stone labyrinths was born the enemy's new nightmare, the vanishing of advantage. Whatever traps he devised, narrow gateways, wired arches, cascading stairs, all could be undone, piece by patient minds. For the first time, the enemy believed in an invisible rival, not strong, but clever. And that was worse. Strength can be endured. Intelligence goes around it. With every day it became clearer. These men with quiet tool bags dictated the rhythm of war. They were the unseen drummers whose beat guided infantry, armor, and artillery, turning chaos into orchestra. And when dry reports mentioned route cleared or barrier neutralized, those who followed knew this was not bureaucracy. It was a promise of breath. A legend is built from repeating miracles. A night under rain, a dark farmhouse. In the attic, a stash. Beneath, a web of wires. The manual says, "Don't enter." The mission says, "You must." Someone kneels. A hand shields the light to make its glow soft as milk. A few precise movements, each ringing faintly in the mind like a quiet bell. And then silence becomes tangible. It doesn't ring, it presses, but no longer threatens. At dawn, the farmhouse greets infantry with the scent of wet wood and newly baked bread. The enemy, later returning, finds neatly cut wire tails and understands someone is playing this game better. The first battles revealed another law, the law of endurance. Where commanders demanded speed, engineers created possibility. Where soldiers needed faith, they provided proof. Where the enemy craved time, they stole it. That theft of time was the purest form of victory. A defense planned for one night collapsed before sunrise. A minefield meant to last a day disappeared in hours. A doomed bridge stayed standing, its explosives turned against themselves. and the enemy began to hate his own designs. And when a man begins to hate his own plans, fear has already taken his hands. Then came what war always breeds: nicknames. The Night Tailors, for they cut the darkness into straight lines of passage. The Iron Tamers, for every spring lost its bite in their palms. The ones who turn off the sky, because after their work, enemy spotlights looked like blind eyes. These names passed in whispers, lifting the Allies' spirits and slowly poisoning the enemy's confidence. A name, after all, is a form of presence, even when its bearer is far away. North Africa, Sicily, mainland Italy, each chapter brought new experience and a new language for the impossible. They worked among olives and aqueducts, ruins and vineyards, cobblestones and swamps. Everywhere, the rule remained the same: find logic where chaos hides it, and make it serve you. When columns rolled past roads that yesterday existed only on maps, it was clear: legend grows not from speeches, but from small, perfect acts, repeated 1,000 times before dawn. The greatest compliment an enemy can give is to start treating your actions as natural law. And that too happened. Where barriers rose at dusk, by morning a thin white flag marked clear. Where night promised traps, dawn revealed tire tracks. This repetition eroded will. When your prohibitions are quietly broken often enough, the prohibition ceases to be power. It becomes a plea. And in war, a plea is defeat. The first battles had done their work. Craft became reputation. Reputation became legend. And legend, an invisible weapon carried not by the hand, but by fear. Now that weapon moved toward new shores, where earth itself would speak in iron, louder than ever before. Where every grain of sand would count the seconds, every drop of water would mirror the sparks of fate. Where silence and precision would face the tallest walls built by the belief in eternity. And there, the legend would prove that even eternity has a circuit that can be broken. Dawn came not in gold, but in steel. The sea breathed with the heavy flanks of landing craft, each wave carrying a cargo of hope and doubt, as if the water itself had become a gambling table for the dice of fate. The shore was no line on a map. It was a blade to be passed without cutting to the bone. And on that blade stood the men who worked in silence to give thunder a doorway and storms a direction. That morning, sand, the eternal archive of winds, became a mirror for fire, catching shrapnel, bullets, drops of blood, and returning them in the tremor felt under the feet of every man stepping into the unknown, uncertain if the earth itself might explode beneath him. The elements conspired against the living. Water pulled back, air shredded with the scream of shells, and the sand seemed to whisper to each ear, "Freeze." But this was precisely where the work of silence began. The enemy's fear was born not from the roar of naval guns, but from the unseen people walking ahead of the noise, shutting down the main switches of the defense. On a beach that promised only death, thin corridors suddenly appeared, as if the sand itself remembered old paths and revealed them to those who knew how to ask. Where there should have been explosions, there was quiet. Where they expected a deadly circuit to close, there was a pause. Where the plan said impossible, a faint pencil mark rewrote it to possible. These beaches, named like harmless islands from a school geography book, turned out to be the senior class of the engineering school, with an exam administered by concrete, steel, wire, and time. Wire obstacles stood like black skeletons of extinct creatures waiting to snag a tank tread. Mines crouched in the sand patiently, like fish in the mud. Wooden cribs hid a violent heart ready to burst under the first heavy step. Here, every mistake cost lives, and silence had to work louder than ever. Men with tool bags and probes moved low as shadows, high as thought. One hand in the sand, the other sketching possible routes on a sheet of paper. In the loudest moment of attack, there is always a second when the heartbeat of a single man can be heard. On this strip between wave and wall, such seconds stretched into eternities, and in them, things were done that would never make a bold headline. One swift pull, removing a charge from a soaked sack. One precise cut, severing the right wire while leaving the lure alive. One glance, spotting a hidden secondary hook inside the teeth of a wire obstacle. One nod, and the column crawled forward, piling earth into cover where a heartbeat ago there had been only open ground. Above the sand ruled concrete, casemates, gun nests, bunkers staring at the sea like ancient idols, certain time could not move them. But time had found its hands. Engineering thought did not headbutt the wall. It searched for the nerve to shut down the whole stone beast. Where was the weak seam? Where had strain overworked a joint? Where had damp crept deeper than the builders knew? Where did sound reveal a hollow where the blueprint claimed solid mass? And once found, the charge was placed not like a bomb, but like a key, fitting the lock, breaking it without spectacle, opening the needed gap for their own forces. Fear deepened when iron confidence dissolved not in chaos, but in order. The defense plan relied on attackers rushing into wire, bogging down in confusion, drowning in chaos. Instead came sequence: clear, mark, pass, secure, move on. It repeated like a watchmaker's hammer, calm to the point of defiance, pounding away inside the hurricane. For a defender who believed hurricanes swallowed all clocks, it was a shock to watch the clocks eat the hurricane. Their beachwork had two sides, pulling death out of the sand and stitching life into the shore. Some strips went dark, others were born. Planks, sandbags, metal sections slapped together like giants' clothing became temporary roads, so heavy machines rolled instead of sinking. Every meter was its own small battle, with sticky sand, with slanting rain of shards, with sharp wind pushing salt and tears into eyes. But every meter taken from the elements and the steel turned battle's din into an ordered process, and in that order lay the power to advance by step, not by scream. The most piercing scenes came not at the water's edge, but at concrete doors guarded by human will. In the thickest silences, you could hear the breath of both the defender behind the gun slit and the attacker fitting the steel and fire key. In those moments, stone became a face, and the opening a mouth meant to speak the single word: now. When that word came, short, without fanfare, those waiting marched through, turning the narrow beach into the first road across a country. That day, lessons were learned in real time: how to ready a soaked charge so it wouldn't catch cold and fail, how to read wire that a wave tried to disguise as seaweed, how to talk to heavy vehicles so they trusted thin planks and canvas roadway, how to mark paths so even the burned and deaf could follow without error. Bullets gave the lectures, chalk on wet metal wrote the notes, and the final exam was the road that had to be born right now, or never. In the hottest hour, someone still found a moment to tuck a short note into a tin box under the sand. A few dry words for the next man. Clear to the embankment. Caution, twin charges at the concrete tooth. Follow the marks. Dry, almost lifeless, these words became living bridges between fate and the next step. That was how silence learned to speak, briefly, clearly, with no room for misunderstanding. And that speech was the music that turned beach into the start of the continent. When the earth stopped trembling like a panicked heart and began humming like a steady engine, the work of silence showed itself. The roar of the sea rolled back, the scream of steel retreated, and the sand kept its marks, not just from boots and tracks, but thin chalk lines, flags, numbers washed away, but still remembered by those they guided past fear's command. These marks don't appear in parades or propaganda, but they hold the world together like a button holds to thread, unseen, firm, ordinary. And when the enemy, sure of his eternity, looked back at the strip meant to be a mass grave for attackers, he saw a road built by night, under fire, with hands armed with probes, chalk, and patience. That day, the Wehrmacht's fear got a new name. Not bombardment, not naval fire, not mass, but order. Order unbroken by water or lead, because it grew from discipline and craft learned one breath from death. When order walks through chaos and remains itself, defense loses its voice. Concrete begins to doubt its own truth, and doubt is the first crack in any monolith. From that crack began the road inland, where silence would continue its work, not on sand, but among fields, bridges, and cities, yet to hear how the impossible can be quietly switched off. Fear was born not from thunder, but from the silence that returned night after night, and by dawn turned forbidden zones into open routes, as if the earth itself had signed its surrender in chalk on wet asphalt. For a defense built on steel and concrete, the most destructive force was not brute strength, but the persistence of order. Where chaos was expected, rhythm appeared. Where mistakes were anticipated, method took over. Where traps were set, a careful hand removed the sting, leaving structures intact but defeated. In this soundless logic lived a cold fear. If night keeps canceling impossible, then the very idea of the impassable dies first. Belief in eternal barriers cracked the moment entire lines of obstacles were found disarmed by the book, as if the enemy had read the minds of the defense's architects. Officers shook their heads at plans where every if had been calculated, yet never accounted for the patient hand that could wait for the right tremor in the ground and hear metal reveal itself even in fog. In desperation, they strengthened camouflage, built cascading detonators, cross-wired circuits. But the trick was the same. The cleverer the trap, the more it became a textbook for those learning on the front line at every dawn. Rumors on German positions did more damage than formal orders. Night tailors, sky switchers, iron tamers. Such nicknames drifted through trenches like drafts. They were not boasts. They were acknowledgments of a superior skill. Rumor shapes perception. If a shot misfires, they're already here. A small white mark on a plank. The route is open. If a night was too quiet, troops braced for daylight losses without a fight, and that without a fight sparked more fear than artillery preparation. Fear altered garrison behavior, extra inspections, slower pace, excessive caution, each delay stealing irreplaceable minutes from the defense. One of the strongest fortresses fell not to demolition, but to a sentry's doubt, seeing a shadow shaped like a flag, changing his patrol route, leaving a dead zone just wide enough for a breach by dawn. A defense built on psychological pressure, on the promise of instant death for a single misstep, now faced a new terror, the fear of not noticing the quiet. And the more they became convinced of danger everywhere, the more the defense was dismantled by those who offered precise safety in narrow, chalk-marked corridors remembered by those who had passed through. German engineers tried to mirror the tactics: double traps, false clear paths, magnetic surprises in unexpected places. Yet the mirror had a flaw. Against disciplined precision, mirroring required even greater discipline, and that ran out quickly under fire and urgency. American engineers turned every trick into a solvable problem, logging the conditions and solutions in dark, rain-smudged notebooks, their meaning becoming sharper with practice. The minefield as a death sentence turned into minefield as procedure, and procedure became the timetable for battalion movements. The most frightening sight for the Wehrmacht was not a collapsing bunker, but a column walking calmly along an impossible route, each turn marked by a tiny chalk line like a heartbeat. No one looking back, because they trusted the unseen master who had passed through here the night before. That trust in silence made noise unnecessary. At that moment, the defense understood that its weapon, sound, was no longer the only language of power. And when power loses its voice, all that remains is to wait and fear the whisper that opens doors. Thus, psychological warfare became the inertia of fear. Any fresh defensive line began aging before it was even activated, because somewhere a pencil was already being sharpened, a wire coil unwound, a matchbox dried in the palm with a note, "Clear to the bridge." This quiet timestamp was stronger than the roar of guns. The Wehrmacht's fear crystallized into a blend of respect and helplessness. Respect for a craft that changed the very texture of war, and helplessness in the face of an order that arrived in the night and stayed through the day. With that invisible victory, silence earned the right to lead further, into tactics that break schemes, and into fates that will write the price of such wordless mastery. Their tactics didn't look like a bold arrow on a map. They resembled a musical score, where every note was an action measured to the breath, and each pause was a life preserved, hidden in silence. They didn't assault abstract positions. They dissected them, breaking defenses down to nerves and tendons, cutting only what kept the enemy standing. The essence of their art lay in 3 invisible steps. First, listening to the space, then retraining it, finally making it work for the attackers. They turned terrain into an ally the way a carpenter turns raw timber into a supporting beam, quietly, but forever. The enemy, used to duels of steel, faced for the first time a duel of logic, when a trap didn't explode but became a doorway. This didn't break walls, it broke confidence. How do you defend against an opponent who comes not with a battering ram, but with a pencil, and still wins? First principle, removing the main nail. Every defense rests on certain nodes: bridges, tight passes, road junctions, river crossings, phone hubs, hidden depots. They didn't fight the whole structure. They found the one critical point and relieved the tension across the system. Sometimes it was a humble wire in the mud feeding a cascade. Sometimes a tiny joint in an arch, whose fatigue could only be felt by tapping it with a fingertip as a stethoscope. The strike hit meaning, not area, and the meaning collapsed like a prop pulled from under the stage. Second principle, multiple routes. The enemy counted on attackers using the only gate, piling hell upon it. These men created 2, 3 seams in the fabric of defense, making the very idea of a choke point meaningless. One was primary, one a silent reserve, one a decoy, forcing the garrison to split its strength and nerve. Concentration, the backbone of defense, dissolved. Where they expected one hurricane, 3 winds came. One broke, one distracted, one led columns through unnoticed drafts. Third principle, reverse engineering traps. Any barrier is someone's design. It can be diffused or turned against its maker. Detonator cascades were adjusted to cancel each other, mines grouped into safe pockets, wire nets redirected onto new anchors, depriving the defender of visible sectors. Sometimes moving a single stake erased a fire sector, turning a kill corridor into a safe street. This wasn't done for mischief, but to save time, tame the mechanism, and you don't have to fight its effects. Fourth principle, hiding order. Their work had to be invisible both before and after. Tracks erased, flags hidden under branches, chalk leaving marks clear to friends but meaningless to foes. The road looked ordinary, the bridge old, the walls unchanged. This invisibility was a second armor. If the enemy couldn't see how he lost, he couldn't repair quickly, and time stolen from realization was more life for the columns. Fifth principle, tempo architecture. They built the offensive's rhythm. A window on the bridge at night, another in the quarter by dawn, one on the highway by noon. The day moved to notes. This segmented timing denied the defense its chance to regather. Where defense tried to control time, their metronome ruled, bringing battalions, convoys, medics into sync. Tempo was a weapon. It didn't roar, but it shaped victory. Sixth principle, targeting weak axes. Every defense has psychology, dependency on familiar routes, safe layouts, favorite tricks. They broke habits. If mines were masked under natural unevenness, they lured the enemy into making artificial mistakes. They led the defense like a chess master leads a novice, not by force, but by anticipating the next move. Over time, these principles formed what would be coldly called suppression of defense, but it was more a re-education of war's fabric. Stone was taught to be a door, water to be a bridge, sand to be a road, cities to be corridors, not cages. Above all, people were taught to march forward by cutting chaos's power supply. Day by day, fear grew in the enemy. But so did respect, a dangerous mix, because respect dulls hatred and breeds caution where boldness is needed. And caution in defense is a cracked hinge on a door, easier to open. In that crack appeared unsung heroes, those who paid for another's confidence with their own heartbeat. Their stories would be the next step in this chronicle, where silence burns into names and letters smelling of gunpowder and rain. Their faces rarely appeared in the newsreels. The camera caught only the backs in soaked tunics, elbows clutching tool bags close to the body, and helmeted napes glistening with water indistinguishable from sweat. They arrived first and left last, leaving no signature, only small marks. A chalk line at the edge of an embankment, a short note in a tin box, a stake with a scrap of white cloth. Their names lived more often in the mouths of comrades than in official orders, quiet, without titles, without fanfare. They sounded like passwords whispered carefully so as not to spill their meaning. One night, he wrote only 3 words on a damp scrap: clear to bridge. By morning, an entire battalion crossed that bridge, and no one thought to find the author. The road was all that mattered. But that same day, on the far bank, under rain and lead, his hand faltered for just a fraction, not from fear, but from exhaustion. It was enough for metal to remember its purpose. The explosion swallowed the silence and his name, leaving only the route that now belonged to fate. Glory never reaches the places where payment is made in full, up front. Their letters home carried the smell of damp paper and time. There were no grand phrases, only short lines. Alive, it's raining here. Boots holding up. On schedule. Don't worry, I'm careful. Care. That was their religion. They confessed not to a priest, but to clocks and rulers. They wrote about how the earth moans beneath the probe, how wet sand deceives the eye, how the salt of the sea tastes different from the salt of sweat, and how that difference can sometimes hide a life. The homes that waited for them heard in these letters the music of their craft, where every note was heavy but honest, and where the words, "I'll be back," were never spoken loudly, so as not to scare the road. One story was told through companies like a talisman and a warning. A bridge at night, black-shouldered water below, wind above, eager to rip away voices. 2 wires, both correct, both wet, both leading to the heart of a cascade. The manual said one thing, the ear another. He waited for a gust big enough to hear the plank beneath his feet breathe, and in that breath found the hidden spring. The knife went not where paper ordered, but where the paws pointed. By morning, the column passed without a backward glance. By evening, someone asked angrily, why wasn't his name mentioned? Because sometimes a name is extra weight on a bridge that's still standing. Their hands knew the price of a tremor. A tremor is not fear. It's a body's language saying too many hours without sleep, blood heavier than it should be, eyes learning to see where nothing is. They learn to still the tremor with breath, short, even, without wasted motion, the way hot metal is stilled by water. Where another man would say, later, they said now, knowing a trap has a favorite time, the weary morning. Often that's when biting moments came, when a screwdriver slipped from tired fingers, and that slip turned into a prophecy. They fought against prophecies, turning them into procedures. Once, in a town smelling of stone damp and olive smoke, he found a weak seam in an arch, invisible to both light and touch. Only sound betrayed it. Biting a metal spoon and tapping the stone, in one spot it rang hollow. He placed there a charge so small it could be mistaken for bread, and the arch opened like a door without waking the houses nearby. Infantry passed, the city exhaled, and he lay on a rooftop, letting morning lick away the night's sweat. The soldiers looked for him to nod in thanks, but he had already gone on to the next shadow. They rarely argued with fate, but often argued with time. Time likes to compress where it's noisy and sprawl where it's quiet. Their job demanded the opposite. Stretch the second of checking, compress the hour of preparation. They came early and left late, not out of heroism, but from the duty of craft. Without the small things done in time, the big ones become impossible. When heavy machinery growled gratefully over a new causeway, their hearts said not, "We won," but "We made it in time." Each had a personal talisman. One carried an old pencil with a chewed end that always writes in rain. Another kept a cracked mirror that shows truth through the crack. A third had a coil of wire that never tangles, though they all knew wire loves to snarl at the worst moment. Such superstitions weren't for stories. They were for breath. When a hand grasped a familiar thing, chaos stepped back by the width of a palm, and sometimes that was enough to move into thinner air. They disliked talk. Their words were short because long ones can't fit into silence. Probe. Hold. Wait. Cut. Stop. This pocket vocabulary weighed less than fear, but they had a long language, the language of actions. It stretched from shore to city, from field to bridge, from night to day, and over it walked those who believed not in shouts, but in order. In that language, the main word was past. Everything else was commentary. Sometimes their reward came as silence after noise. The column left, dust settled, and on the road stood one man with a bag. He looked at the tire marks and knew, no, the night wasn't wasted. It was worth the fingers cut on wet wire, worth teaching the eyes the difference between a living shadow and a dead one. This quiet dialogue with the road was their applause, without hands, without stage, but with the warm pulse that keeps a man standing when war's surf pounds overhead. Their falls were as quiet as their lives, a silent trip over an invisible thread, a silent miscalculation of a stone's weight, a silent failure to catch the extra breath of wind, a silent slide into water that didn't ask for a name. Silence took them back like an old mistress, and only comrades knew the exact spot that deserved a 1-second pause, exactly one, before moving on. Not out of cruelty, out of respect, because the best thing you can do for the one who's gone is to finish his road. Every legend has a name never spoken aloud, the one who moved a bridge from the list of losses to the list of routes, the one who switched off a quarter's trap and switched it on for passage, the one who, on a night when wind-sliced rain found the right seam by touch and opened a new page for his men. These names remain in the work, like a master's signature on the back of a painting. Viewers never see it, but without it, the painting would never live. They were called heroes without glory, not because they were denied it, but because glory couldn't keep up with their speed. They lived between breath and blast, between step and fall, between chalk and flame. Their day began with silence and ended there. And if war has a heart that dislikes noise, it beat in their hands, steady, stubborn, until the road became possible. Then they vanished again into shadow, where a new task was already waiting, to give shape to chaos, turning it into order so someone else could go forward, unaware of the debt behind each step. Victory rarely sounds like fanfare to those who built it from small nails and quiet decisions. It arrives like an exhausted morning, when the road finally stops resisting and lets the columns move without persuasion, and the bridges hold, as if they've always been on the living side. For those who worked in silence, victory looked like the world rearranged. Fire gave way to procedure, chaos to schedule, concrete to measured precision. It felt as though war itself had agreed to speak the language their patience had taught it. But every kind of order has a price, one not found in reports. Reports don't know how to count the pauses, the held breaths, the sleepless nights, the minutes stretched into eternity, all those invisible coins that bought the right to move forward. The costliest bill came right after the line, "Route cleared." That moment, when a column had not yet said thank you and the road had just accepted its weight, silence demanded payment, the names of those who would not finish the very route they had opened. It was bitter arithmetic. For the many to pass, the few had to become part of the road itself. Their steps disappeared into planks, into steel frames, into gaps in the concrete, so no one else would fall through. The cost wasn't only life. War bit into body and spirit without asking. Pieces went missing. Fingers burned steady. Hearing ruined, tuned forever to silence louder than explosions. Eyes trained to tell living shadow from dead, now unable to rest. Backs remembering the weight of bags and the angle of night. Knees that memorized every shard of gravel by touch. This was the price of a craft that spoke to the materials of war as equals. Stone answered with pain, water with cold, metal with burns, time with sleeplessness. All of it gathered inside a body that later had to live among a peace too noisy for those who had known another kind of quiet. After one major breakthrough, the barracks filled not with silence, but with emptiness, as if a door had been taken off and wind could now pass through. They set a bag on the table. Everyone knew whose it was, heavier than before, as though the tools inside had soaked up the seconds of a life. From it came a chalk stick with a broken tip, a mirror scratched across the glass, a probe with dried rain on its tip, and a small note, "Clear to the Grove." The note became the nameplate for an empty bunk, and that day they finally understood the true cost of the word clear, which until then had sounded so routine. Victory didn't just redraw maps, it rewired the Army's memory. Where they once moved cautiously, they now kept tempo, trusting invisible corridors. Where they once stopped before a bridge, they paused only long enough to see a chalk mark left by night. Where they once awaited thunder, they now waited for order. That trust became a new resource, as vital as ammunition or fuel. It reduced fear, sharpened thought, and saved lives. But trust risked turning into habit, and those who worked in silence knew. Habit is a treacherous enemy. It softens fingers and lulls the ear. So each new path had to be cleared as if it were the first. That repetition was their permanent fatigue. There were days when victory smelled not of gunpowder, but of bread, warm, simple, almost domestic. In a town where walls had whispered the night before, by morning, a bakery reopened. Soldiers, workers, women with children lined up for bread. No one remembered the night of chalk, mirrors, and wire. They remembered only the taste of fresh crust. And somewhere nearby stood a man with a tool bag, watching the steam rise. And he knew all those millimeters had been worth it. That too was part of victory, warm, fragile, visible. More often, though, victory looked like a cold ledger, secured, reinforced, delivered, transferred, held. In those verbs, faces disappeared. To return them, comrades kept small rituals, a short pause on a new crossing, a mark of chalk on a tree no one touched again, a symbol scratched inside a helmet, a letter understood only by their own. In these quiet footnotes, victory remembered the seconds and decisions that built it. One day they reached a bridge that by every rule should have been destroyed, but it stood unharmed, as if someone on the other side had also paid with silence. In such moments, war looked like a dialogue between two crafts, where respect outweighed rage. They crossed it without damage, and someone said quietly, "Let it stand." Not out of mercy, out of understanding. A bridge always belongs to the future, and the future must have the right to a road. For those who gave war its order, peace brought a new challenge. The world now felt too loose, crosswalks misaligned, stairs slick, doors without proper locks, bridges humming with hollow vibration, streets unmarked by chalk, people walking without watching their feet. This freedom disturbed them. The silence that had been ally in war became echo in peace. They learned to live with it, finding work that gave order meaning again. Builders, engineers, electricians, surveyors. The same hands, the same eyes. Only now the mines were faults, the detonator chains were schematics, the flags replaced with safety signs. Victory continued in another form, the cost returning as interest, experience handed down to apprentices. The final line of their ledger was never written in ink, but in rain, on a roadside stone, on a wooden beam, on a rail's underside where a hand might reach for balance. A short scratch, unreadable to strangers. Their way of saying, "We were here, we did it, we've gone." And every time something important passed that way, bread trucks, school buses, ambulances, the sign seemed to warm slightly, as if the price once paid in night returned as warmth by day. For them, victory was never a pedestal. It was a bridge. Others crossed it, sometimes without looking back, and that was right. Their reward was a world that could once again walk without fear, roads that allowed haste safely. Their price, the names that dissolved into silence so they could live again in simple words. Clear. Ready. Move on. In those words lay their glory, invisible but load-bearing, like the arch that holds not itself, but everyone passing beneath. War fades, but its silence remains. It lingers in objects, gestures, and crafts, the way the smell of rain clings to wooden walls, not shouting, but tuning the air to another note. The legacy of those night craftsmen lives not in loud words, but in order itself, in the way bridges are now built to fail quietly, not catastrophically, in roads designed with drainage that keeps rain from becoming a trap, in every complex structure first listened to before it's drawn, designed with its future weaknesses in mind. Their school taught, the greatest weapon is procedure, and the highest courage is discipline, refined into music. Every army has grenadiers and tank crews. Every history honors heroes with banners. But few remember the names of those who, in the dark, waved chalk instead of flags. And yet, it is their handwriting the world reads every morning. Each time we cross a bridge, wait at an intersection, drive through a tunnel, and no longer hold our breath, we trust the invisible corridors of safety they created. They taught cities not to crumble at thunder, but to answer it with order. They taught architecture to see the limits inside strength. They taught roads to respect water, not fight it. Their language of silence became the standard for those who save rather than destroy. The sappers of peaceful days speak the same short words: stop, hold, cut, clear. As they lift old wars from the ground, take apart worn bridges, remove dangerous ice from roofs, or seal off places where curiosity outweighs caution. Engineering schools now teach how to hear materials, not just measure them. Safety manuals value small clauses over slogans. City crews use small flags that decide more fates than blaring sirens. Silence has earned its citizenship and a job. Sometimes it seems they are still walking ahead, not with helmets, but with checklists, not with probes, but with pens, yet with the same stubborn faith that order is stronger than chaos. When a highway reopens after a storm, when power returns overnight to a blacked-out district, when a tunnel smells again of air instead of fear, that is their method speaking. Checked. Clear to go. And every time the world passes by without noticing the effort, it honors them perfectly. Their greatest reward remains invisibility. History loves loud names, but the endurance of peace rests on quiet ones. Museums show banners and polished helmets, but somewhere in their archives lie the true regalia: a small scratched mirror, a probe darkened by rain, a broken piece of chalk in a damp tin box. Teachers show these to students and speak not of the courage to rush forward, but of the courage to pause, not of assault, but of sequence, not of shouting, but of breathing. And even now, those who make the impossible passable still work to that same rhythm, learning to hold the pause that separates maybe from certain. Their memory isn't carved in marble or bound by stairs. It lives in humanity's habit of walking without fear of its own step. That habit is their victory. A world that doesn't flinch on bridges, a city where concrete no longer groans, a road that doesn't bite back at rain. When dusk lays itself over the highway and headlights draw their silver thread of motion, above it bends their invisible light, the light of care and craft. And as long as that light remains in our rules and our hands, their legend endures, not as a story of the past, but as an instruction for the present. Listen deeper, act precisely, work in silence, so thunder will always have a door. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked it, please give it a like, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell so you don't miss new videos. There are more amazing stories to come. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones.